Margaret Campbell, the Duchess of Argyll, had it all: beauty, wealth, and a place at the heart of Britain's elite. But she was hiding a dark secret that could destroy everything. Suspicious of his wife, her husband broke into a locked drawer and made a discovery that shocked him to his core. What he found would ignite one of Britain's most notorious scandals, a scandal that would follow Margaret to her grave. The woman who would one day become the Duchess of Argyll was born as Ethel Margaret Wigham on the 1st of December 1912 in Newton Mearns, a small town in Renfrewshire in western Scotland. Her father was George Hay Wigham, a successful businessman who for many years was the chairman of the Celanese Corporation, a dual British and North American company that specialised at the time in the production of synthetic materials out of substances like cellulose. The family was well connected and wealthy as a result, though not staggeringly rich by contemporary standards. Margaret's mother was Helen Mann Hannay. Growing up, Margaret attended a series of private and boarding schools in both New York and in Scotland, in line with the family's business interests being in both the United States and Britain. These included around 14 years at the elite Hewitt School on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Her family travelled a good amount, and they enjoyed holidaying in France and in places like the Isle of Wight. It was a cosmopolitan upbringing, though not an entirely happy one. Her parents' marriage was strained as a result of George's many affairs, and Margaret's mother often used her to try and mediate in their marital rows. The chaos of her parents' marriage left a mark on Margaret that would shape the rest of her life. Years later, biographers would draw a direct line between her fractured childhood and the scandals that made her infamous. But Margaret's descent into controversy didn't begin as a duchess. It began as a teenager, with a forbidden romance and a closely guarded secret. Even before her debutante years, Margaret's beauty and charm attracted a succession of wealthy and well-connected admirers. But behind the glamour was a growing appetite for risk, and one teenage romance would change her life forever. In 1928, while on one of her family's holidays to the Isle of Wight, she began a relationship with David Niven, a figure who would go on to become a famous actor who won an Academy Award for his role in the film Separate Tables in 1958. At the time, Niven was 18 and Margaret was 15. But what began as a summer romance quickly spiraled into a crisis when Margaret became pregnant. When Margaret's parents learned of the pregnancy, they were appalled. One maid later recalled that all hell broke loose. For a wealthy upper-class family in 1928, an unmarried teenage daughter expecting a child threatened not only disgrace, but social ruin. Determined to avoid a scandal at any cost, her parents acted swiftly. Margaret was taken to London and subjected to a secret abortion at a time when the procedure was still illegal in Britain. Just 15 years old, she found herself caught in a nightmare that had to remain hidden from the world. The experience must have been traumatic, and it was so deeply buried that Margaret would later omit it entirely from her memoirs. Yet, remarkably, she never lost her affection for David Niven, remaining on good terms with him for decades, and even attending his funeral in 1983, 55 years after their brief fling on the Isle of Wight. But if her family hoped this painful episode would teach Margaret caution, they were mistaken, for greater scandals and far more dangerous romances still lay ahead. In 1930, when Margaret was 18, she made her debut at the Royal Court in London and was titled as Debutante of the Year. Thereafter, she became one of the most talked about socialites of the 1930s by employing clever manipulation of the tabloid newspapers and also harnessing her good looks. For instance, she regularly appeared in magazines and was often commented on for her dress sense and hairstyle. As her fame grew, so did the number of wealthy and influential men vying for her attention. Among them was Charles Greville, the 7th Earl of Warwick, who became so infatuated that he proposed marriage. Margaret accepted, and for a time it seemed that she was destined to become Countess of Warwick. Yet when the moment came, she abruptly called off the wedding, leaving society gossip columns in a frenzy. It was an early sign that Margaret had little intent of following convention. At the same time, she was also romantically linked to Prince George, Duke of Kent, a younger son of King George V of Britain and one of the most eligible bachelors in the country. But Margaret was not a woman who remained unattached for long. The collapse of her engagement to Warwick did little to slow her rise through high society. If anything, it only added to her allure. Just a year after she broke things off with Warwick, Margaret married for the first time. This was to Charles Sweeney, an amateur golfer and stockbroker who hailed from a very rich Irish-American family, one that had made a lot of money in mining during the Gilded Age of late 19th century America. She even converted to Roman Catholicism to facilitate the marriage, and the ceremony became one of the most talked about social events of 1933. It literally stopped traffic in the streets surrounding the Brompton Oratory in Kensington in London where it was held. Particular attention focused on Margaret herself. Her wedding dress, designed by Norman Hartnell, a fashion designer who had produced dresses for the women of the British royal family, was widely admired and remains on display at London's Victoria and Albert Museum today. It marked the beginning of a lifelong association with glamour and high fashion. To outsiders, the marriage appeared to have it all: wealth, status, and sophistication. Behind closed doors, however, the relationship was steadily falling apart. The union would last more than 14 years, but by Margaret's own account, it was deeply unhappy. All Charlie wanted in a wife was a pretty, brainless doll, she later complained. They were both unfaithful and engaged in numerous affairs. Then, in 1943, Margaret came terrifyingly close to death. In an incident that briefly captured newspaper attention, she plunged 40 feet or 12 meters down a lift shaft. The fall was so violent that she narrowly avoided being killed. Recalling the ordeal years later, she stated, "The only thing that saved me was the lift cable, which broke my fall. I must have clutched at it, for it was later found that all of my fingernails were torn off. I apparently fell onto my knees and cracked the back of my head against the wall." Though it appears to have been nothing more than a freak accident, Margaret was lucky to survive. The marriage eventually ended in divorce in 1947. It was not without complications though, as she and Charles had had 3 children by then, though the first of these in 1933 was a stillborn. A daughter, Frances Helen, and a son, Brian Charles, followed in 1937 and 1940, both of whom lived long lives. Margaret's natal history was otherwise very complicated, with her suffering numerous miscarriages, as well as the stillbirth before Frances was born, possibly a consequence of the manner in which the abortion she underwent as a teenager was carried out. Following the collapse of her marriage to Sweeney, Margaret soon became engaged to Joseph Thomas, a Texan-born banker of Lehman Brothers. Yet the relationship proved short-lived. Before they could marry, Thomas fell in love with another woman, and the engagement was called off. Margaret then began a brief relationship with Theodore Rousseau, the curator at the time of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Not long after that, she met Ian Douglas Campbell, the 12th Duke of Argyle, one of the most senior aristocrats in Scotland, while on a train journey. They soon began a relationship, and that just as quickly turned into her second marriage when they wed one another on the 22nd of March 1951. She was 38, he was 47. On the surface of it, Margaret's marriage to Argyle and her ascent as the Duchess of Argyll seemed to be a move up the social ladder, the attractive socialite of the 1930s, finally finding happiness after her first failed marriage. But as we will soon see, her second marriage was even more tumultuous. While Campbell was a scion of a very prestigious aristocratic family, and they owned extensive lands around Inverary Castle in western Scotland, in reality, the dukedom was in severe financial straits. The British government had taken it upon itself to heavily tax the aristocracy after the Second World War as part of its efforts to rebuild Britain. This combined with Argyle's alcoholism, gambling, and addiction to prescription drugs had created major financial difficulties, and while Margaret was theoretically marrying up the social ladder, it was Wigham family money which saved Argyle from having to sell his ancestral castle. Sadly, marital bliss was not on the cards for Margaret, and as the years passed, the marriage soon descended into bitterness and hostility. Argyle was also physically and psychologically abusive, something which was later corroborated by his first two ex-wives. Then, during their vicious marital war, he made a discovery that would detonate one of the most sensational scandals in modern British history and destroy Margaret's reputation forever. By the early 1960s, Margaret's marriage existed in name only, and both were considering divorce. Convinced that the Duchess was being unfaithful, Argyle took matters into his own hands. While Margaret was in New York, he hired a locksmith to force open a locked cupboard in their Mayfair home. Once inside, he discovered a collection of photographs that shocked him and confirmed everything he feared about his wife. He then proceeded to apply for a divorce based on her infidelity, hoping that he would also win a financial settlement as part of the proceedings. When the case came to trial in 1963, it generated a lot of press attention. How could it not when it involved one of Scotland's leading aristocrats and his wife, a woman who had been one of England's most notable socialites for decades? However, as sensational as the case already was, the real explosion came when Argyle unveiled the photographs he had obtained. Overnight, what had been a high-profile aristocratic divorce became a national obsession. Among the images were Polaroids showing the Duchess posing nude, except for her trademark 3-strand pearl necklace, in the company of an unidentified man. Another photograph captured her engaged in a sexual act with a lover whose identity could not be determined. In an age when divorce was still controversial enough in and of itself, this was highly incendiary. The case descended into a media circus thereafter, one in which all of the salacious details of the Argyles' chaotic marriage were aired in public. The allegations then grew even more sensational. The Duke accused Margaret of having affairs with no fewer than 88 men. The figure was almost certainly exaggerated, but that hardly mattered to a press already intoxicated by the scandal. Rumours spread around a remarkable cast of alleged lovers, including members of the British royal family, senior aristocrats, and government ministers. Among those named was Duncan Sandys, the Minister for Defence and son-in-law of Sir Winston Churchill. Each new allegation poured fuel on the fire, and soon Margaret was being dubbed the Dirty Duchess. When the case finally concluded on May 8, 1963, the judgment proved devastating for Margaret. Granting the divorce, the judge declared that the evidence showed the Duchess to be a completely promiscuous woman whose sexual appetite could only be satisfied with a number of men, and condemned her attitude towards marriage as wholly immoral. The remarks were widely reported on, and ensured that the scandal would follow her long after courtroom doors had closed. After months of relentless publicity and public humiliation, the finalization of the divorce must have come as an immense relief. Margaret then fled into seclusion, taking refuge for a time in a remote village on the English-Scottish border. Perhaps the worst element of the divorce and scandal was the rift it caused between Margaret and her daughter Frances. In 1958, Frances had married Charles Manners, 10th Duke of Rutland. Margaret had already frayed the relationship years earlier by trying to insist that Frances raise her own children as Roman Catholics, and this rift intensified during the divorce period. They would not talk for over 2 decades, a sad affair in which mother and daughter would often show up to the same social event in London and refuse to even say hello to one another. As mentioned, Margaret's life was ravaged by the press attention and scandal surrounding her divorce. She attempted several libel suits against newspapers and other outlets for the manner in which they had covered the case and portrayed her. These were unsuccessful and only damaged her financially in the long run. Other efforts at rehabilitating herself included writing a memoir called Forget Not, and even a book on entertaining, but they did not do well, her name still tainted by the events of 1963. By the late 1970s, Margaret was facing serious financial difficulties. In a desperate attempt to maintain her lavish lifestyle, she opened her famous Mayfair home at 48 Upper Grosvenor Street to paying visitors. But the income was not enough. Years of extravagant spending and ill-judged investments had steadily eroded her fortune, and in 1978, she was forced to sell the house that had been her home for more than 4 decades. She then moved into a fancy hotel and lived like this for many years, but she was unable to pay her mounting bills and was ultimately evicted. In 1991, not long before she died, Margaret finally reconciled with her daughter Frances after a decades-long rift. Just 2 years later, in 1993, she suffered a bad fall and died not long after on the 25th of July at 80 years of age. She was penniless at the time and in a nursing home, her reputation having never recovered from the battering inflicted on it 30 years earlier at the time of her infamous divorce. Interestingly, she was laid to rest in Brookwood Cemetery in Woking, Surrey, alongside her first husband, Charles Sweeney, who died just 4 months before her. The Duchess's story generated no shortage of newspaper articles and other media coverage in her own time, and that infamy continued to result in discussions and treatments of her life in the years after 1963. Retrospective looks at the trial appeared in newspapers and magazines for years to come, and in 1995, a chamber opera covering the trial and other events of the Duchess's life appeared at the Cheltenham Music Festival. The most widely known version of her story, though, is the 2021 historical drama series, A Very British Scandal, which received a decent critical reception and starred Claire Foy as the Duchess. Thus, Margaret's story continues to interest the public over 6 decades after her scandalous divorce occurred. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Margaret Campbell, the Duchess of Argyll. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you're more scandalous people or British people, let me know down below in the comments. Also let me know if you have any other suggestions, and I hope all of you are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all of my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.